Alright, so the way I look at it is I start with the stock price. I look at the number of shares outstanding, which you can find in a few different places. One place to find it is just the 10K. The most recent 10 filing, whether it's a 10K or a 10Q, it's usually on like the first page. The way the SEC loads these things, even a super fast computer like mine, it gets a little messed up, so it's not a great system. Right, usually there's shares outstanding. Here it is, 4.137 million, so 4,137 million, so 4.137 billion shares outstanding. So market cap's 112 billion, just a fraction of like Nvidia's. It's funny. Nvidia used to be a pimple on Intel's butt. Now they're bigger than Intel. I'll be uploading this model on my GitHub. All my files are available on my GitHub totally for free as a courtesy to all you folks. Alright. So we need to look up their cash and debt. That's going to be on something called the balance sheet, which is one of the 3 financial statements. If you're not familiar with financial statements, you're about to get a world-class introduction. Financial statements are the life of the markets, the language of the markets, the lingua franca. You cannot understand business without understanding financial statements. The 3 financial statements tell basically the complete picture, the whole story of any company. You can encapsulate the entire business in those 3 statements. So we're just going to look through. The 10K is the annual report, so it's very detailed. It's got a lot of just a ton of data, and we're looking for the 3 financial statements. Sometimes it's sequestered in a separate file. Sometimes it isn't. But it won't take too long to find. We can also get some abridged financial statements from the press release. Sometimes they're not abridged at all, sometimes they are. I saw Latinx, I have to stop. Intel Latinx Leadership Council. Of course. Very woke. Alright, here's the income statement. So this the income statement tracks period results. That means for a year or for a quarter or for whatever. The balance sheet is a snapshot statement. It tracks. It tells you the account values at a specific date. So it's like a camera. It takes a photo. And this is what we wanted. We want the most updated cash balance of the company, and that is for available each quarter. So the most recent one is available for this quarter, so we can get that added up. Looks like 34 billion, roughly. You got to include anything that's kind of a liquid instrument, in my opinion. So those 2 and this one look liquid. And now we got to look at the debt. The debt is 4 billion here and then 37 billion there. And companies use debt for all kinds of reasons, stock buybacks, etc. So that's not necessarily a bad thing or anything. Okay, so those are the big 6. It's 112 billion market cap, 120 billion enterprise value. If you don't know what an enterprise value is, it's a really important concept. If you struggle with that, you're not going to make it very far in investing. Take your time to learn and understand what it is. It's basically the market cap adjusted for the net cash. So kind of what you're paying for the business, if that makes sense. All right, so now let's look at the income statement. We're looking at Intel, or InSmell if you're a juvenile. or if you just lost a lot of money on Intel and you're mad. All right, so let's go back to the income statement because it tells the story of the company. And you can see that the revenue, which is the sales of their product, has gone down quite a lot, actually. They dropped 20% this year, and they only grew 1% in 2021. So it's pretty interesting. Let's look at gross margin. Gross margin is the cost, basically the revenue after cost of goods sold. So it's kind of what's left after you deduct what it took to make the product you've actually sold. And you could look at it as on a percentage basis. So I'm going to look at that on a percentage basis and see how that tracks. It's kind of hard to eyeball that, you know. Maybe there's some savant out there that can eyeball it, but I can't. So looks like 43%. So as their sales went down, their margin dropped. That's kind of like a concept called deleveraging. Now they have some other expenses. R&D is their major expense. It looks like marketing, selling, and administrative, or marketing general administrative is actually their smaller cost. And that's funny because I was looking at Nvidia and Texas Instruments, and that they all kind of work similarly. These semiconductor companies don't really need to advertise. It's kind of amazing. They just make their chips and they sell, and that's it. You know, there's no big marketing push or anything like that. So they turn out to be pretty profitable companies. Although Intel in this year was not very profitable, at least according to the income statement. We're going to look at the cash flow statement. It might tell a different story. So Intel's costs went up and up even though their revenue went down. In fact, you can see their costs rose dramatically over the last 2-3 years, but their revenue has dropped a bit, so it's a bit strange. But again, this could be a function of just a function of accounting. We're not going to include equity investment gains because that's typically not a recurring item. It's kind of a GAAP, non-GAAP thing. GAAP is generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP. And we kind of prefer non-GAAP numbers when possible, although we want to understand the difference between GAAP and non-GAAP. All right, so this is taxes. Again, a non-GAAP concept. We have to basically adjust all this stuff for the fact that GAAP is very imperfect, especially for the investor. GAAP makes a lot of sense from an accounting perspective, but from an investor perspective, we have a lot of adjustments we have to make to kind of try to reflect the steady state of the business. So anyway, those are the last 3 years for Intel. I actually kind of want to look at Nvidia real quick just so you can get a sense for, like, I'm going to put it up here. You get a sense for just how different these two companies are. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So Nvidia's a lot smaller revenue-wise, even though they've got 3 times the market cap. Isn't that funny? All right, let's look. So this is fiscal year ended 23. So this is sort of going to be like full year 2022. So let's put that in 26,923. And then that's 26,914. That's 16,675. Okay, so Nvidia had a monster 2021, while Intel only grew 1%. And then while Nvidia stayed flat, so in a tough environment, Intel dropped 20%. So you can kind of see the ratio of the two closing, the gap closing, because Nvidia seems to be a lot better positioned than Intel on a product side. Intel sort of always ignored the graphics chip market as, oh, that's a small market, but obviously they messed that up pretty bad. All right, let's now kind of look at the cash flow statement. So the cash flow statement basically reconciles the income statement, and it's pretty complicated, unfortunately. But once you understand how the cash flow statement works, you really start to reach the end of financial statement understanding, and you can sort of get to financial statement interpretation, which is a bit different. Just because you understand it doesn't mean you understand what it says, doesn't mean you really understand what's going on and how to interpret it from an investor's perspective. Those are two different things. But so we're going to basically take what our model's net income is, what reported net income was, and we're going to try to sort of reconcile them, basically. I just want to glance at this. Oh, I see. They had a $4 billion one-time gain. So that's what we excluded. All right. So how did the business go from making, depending on whose definitions, if you use our definition, they made $4 billion in 2022. If you look at Intel's definition, they made $8 billion. But the actual cash they made, so that's the income statement, that's the reported net income. But the actual cash flow they made was $15 billion. So how do you reconcile that? And the same thing happened here, where there's almost no difference between Intel's and ours, and here where there's very little difference between Intel's and ours. They actually had a lot more cash flow. So how did that happen? Well, there's a lot of reasons there. This is a list of all the adjustments. The biggest adjustment is depreciation, which is a non-cash expense, right? When something depreciates, you don't actually lose money. You sort of lose accounting value. And that's the biggest difference. But we also have CapEx, which is a cash expense, but it's not run through the income statement. CapEx is when you buy a good and you capitalize it, and then you depreciate it. So that's kind of a lot of what's going on here, but let's keep looking. And theoretically, those two should kind of balance out. I mean, this is like a Bob Ross. I'm tempted to say something about little trees or something like that, but I don't know, what does he say? Happy little trees. It's happy little depreciation. And there's amortization. We are looking at Intel, yeah. EBITDA is a acronym that means earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. If I didn't name my cat Trashy, I was going to name her EBITDA. I know somebody who named their dog EBITDA. Amortization is like depreciation, just for intangible items. Alright, divestitures. Yeah, I saw Fetty Wap's in prison. Poor guy. Alright, and finally, working capital changes. So if you add all these up, they actually equal to cash flow from operations, or probably better said, this is how you get cash flow from operations. Let's see if it sums up. Didn't work. Let's see why. Might have messed something up. I see. One minus sign makes all the difference. Okay, there it is. All right, so it sounds good that they made $15 billion, but they also had CapEx, so we gotta remove the CapEx, and that's gonna change the picture pretty dramatically. Their CapEx for the year was $24 billion, so Intel lost money this year, or 2022, last year, I guess, which is a little frightening. Again, it was a rough year for semiconductors, But this is supposed to be like this capacity-constrained industry that's supposed to be making a fortune right now. And Intel is one of the only companies that has capacity. So I don't see why they're having such a rough time. You know, the recession's not here. It's not like the economy is contracting too much. So it makes me wonder how they're going to do it in an environment that's a lot worse, right? Like semiconductor companies are very cyclical, so they're very sensitive to economic conditions. And again, Intel's sort of investing for the future, but in cyclical industries, companies do this all the time. When there's a supply constraint and supply is really tight, they invest a ton in factories and equipment, and then guess what happens? The opposite happens, where everybody has a ton of supply and there's all these products and they can't move them. So it's a very cyclical industries are tough for that reason. You know, you have to really time, in the long run it's very hard to do, time the business cycle, which is as hard as it sounds. Very, very difficult. So if you net these two out, you kind of get a concept called free cash flow. And you'll get 21 billion, 11 billion, and a loss of 9 billion. So how do you think about that? You know, the traditional rookie way of doing this stuff is like an earnings multiple, right? An earnings multiple is hey Geggy511, thanks for subscribing. An earnings multiple is kind of a poor man's way of doing a DCF. And how do you put an earnings multiple on earnings that are this volatile, right? If you look at like a company that has steady earnings, that's making 10 billion one year, 10 and a half, 11, etc., you can kind of put a multiple on it, but you can't put a multiple on this, right? Because you put 15 times earnings. Well, in one year the company's worth 300 billion. In another year it's worth 160 billion. Another year it's worth negative. So earnings multiples tend to fail when a company has volatile earnings. So one thing we could do is look at the average earnings, and some people call that CAPE's cyclically adjusted PE ratio. So you look at it over 3 years and you say, okay, they made 7.6 billion. Well, what's the PE ratio, or the EV to E ratio, which is probably more important? 16 times earnings. And you have to think about, well, is that reasonable or not? I don't know. But we also don't know if that's a fair way to look at it, because if this year is another negative year, let's say just a little smaller, now our average number is 4.5 billion. And 26 times is a lot different from 15 times, right? But if it's positive 10 billion, now we're really starting to look at something that could be like a cheap stock. So I really just don't know. And part of it is, if they're doing this free cash flow spend as this kind of big one-time, just like resizing of their footprint so they have more capacity, this would really be obscuring the earnings. And we also don't know why revenue dipped. We have to learn about the company, right? As much as the numbers tell the story of the company, we don't know every detail. We have to really understand the company. Even if these numbers looked really good, I would question it the other way and say, maybe this is a one-time gain that will reverse itself. So investing is really tricky because you have to be an expert in that industry. That's why you notice like none of these files are filled out for hardware and semiconductors, because I don't really follow hardware and semiconductors. I find it fascinating, of course, but look at my biopharma sheet. Every model is filled out because I follow this sector much more closely. But for semiconductors, I don't, it's not my field, and to be able to keep on top of one field is hard enough, let alone 2 or 3 or 4. It's basically impossible.